Danse nito temtik gitatam skatinawa kakio miawatio nehiawewin.
Nagaha nigichobwan ituene na umichin.
Kigachi kandamin eavajituing gitanishnabe mona.
Shoha nitanoja nakuttadat ithachutinat trochit nilik hatkuginjik tatotak.
Daguaja Oge mau beso awases Nagaha Yubamedno Yubamedno.
Kakian authentic no akumagnak, ninashkamun, kinanashkum tinawal, Chenishna bek algonquins kinanashkum tinawal, my kona Wilson Barehead kinanashkum tin, Pinamaya. My friends and relatives, welcome to the Royal Canadian Geographical Society's launch for the United Nations International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Ogimao pe suawase sega seo. One of the spirit names I carry is King Thunderbird Child. My English name is Perry Bellegarde, and I'm the Honorary President of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. In Nehewin, Cree, I have acknowledged the Algonquin people from whose territory, on the banks of the beautiful Ottawa River, I'm joining you today. I also thank my Kona, Wilson Barehead, for the beautiful honor song that he made, acknowledging my role as Honorary President of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. The International Decade, which begins this year, is a global celebration of the richness and diversity of the languages spoken by Indigenous peoples around the world. The decade is also a call to action. The United Nations estimates that more than half of the Indigenous languages in the world could disappear before the end of the century. More than half. The next 10 years are critical to make Indigenous languages living languages. Around the world, Indigenous peoples are mobilizing to teach their languages to younger generations. We are working hard to speak our languages every day, at home, in ceremonies, at school, at community events, and in all aspects of our daily lives. However, the challenge is immense. The state of Indigenous languages is a consequence of decades of colonialism, racism, and discrimination. Terrible harm has been done. Undoing that harm requires concerted and coordinated action in every region of the world, including here at home. In Canada, there is hope. We know that people of all ages are learning our languages as a second language. Mi'kmaq, Inuit, Kainai, Anishinaabemowin, Michif, Siksika Powassan, Halkamenim, Tsimshian, Dene, Inuktitut, Nakota, and Nehewin. These are just some of the more than 70 Indigenous languages spoken in Canada today. Each of these languages represents an entire world of knowledge and meaning. Today, more and more First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people are learning their Indigenous languages. And this is what needs to happen. We need more people of all ages to take up the work of learning their Indigenous language. This is the key to our languages being living languages, used in schools, in ceremony, and in everyday life. There is a depth of meaning and spirit in our languages that can only be passed on in our original tongues. So when I speak Cree, I think of those old people, those wise ones, those elders, Deaf Henry Kay, Gordon Oakes, James Ironeagle, Mrs. Rockthunder, Kokum Dot, Angeline Waskowicz. I think of generation upon generation of elders who spoke Cree when they were passing down the ceremonies. I think of our leaders who spoke Cree, Saulteaux, and Nakota when they entered into treaty with the Crown. Our languages come from the land, and they speak for the land. Our languages are the languages of our songs, our stories, our teachings, our science, and our laws. Our languages convey our history, and our languages are our future, our collective future, together on these lands. Today, I honor all the old people, the elders, the knowledge keepers, the teachers, and the young people who are working so hard to make our languages living languages. So over the next hour, we are celebrating the launch of the International Decade by introducing you to some of the many incredible people who have brought us to this day. I'm inspired by them, and I know they'll inspire you too. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce you to Odeshkin Thuski. Odeshkin from Kitaganzi B is 11 years old, and he is fluent in Anishinaabe. Our young people crave the chance to learn our languages, and they thrive with this opportunity. Odeshkin is one of those young people.
Kwe, Odeshkin Taskin Dishnakars. Kitaganzi B is Taganak and Donjiba. Chad Taski is Ashij Megan Commander, Jinakazo, Dada, Ashij Najuju. Natasha Shich Pejik Nabubones. Hi, my name is Odeshkin Tusky. I am from Rapid Lake, Taganak, and Kitaganzi B. My parents are Chad Tusky and Megan Commander. I am 11 years old, and I'm going to be doing a prayer and a song. We are Daga Jimmy do Kakanage go Gaga Jendung. Megwatch Jimmy do and Jaki. Megwatch on Jakaganage go Netalgin, Mijaskin, where Agajaka am to go. Kakanamish Kiki Kaya medium. Megwatch on Jakagana, where Caesar Kapumode Jiga Neogade Jig Kapamiso Jig Ayakapumatige Jig. Meshkiki or Jig Kaya Marj Meljig. Megwatch on Jenabi, Kaya Kakanaga, Ton Wenchishing. Megwatch on Jenese, one gami Jinga Jibanobu Madzian. Megwatch on Jeshkude gami Jinga Jimano Abajatoyan. Megwatch on Jayoki Jig Kaya Gana, take Isgong. Keys to be keys Kaya and Angashag. Megwatch on Jenna Shomusan, Nagokumasaka Kanada do Demak. With the Kawashin Kajano Bakayan. With the Kawayakas Jig Shwanim, Nebujik the Marcus Jig Kaya, while Wisnajig. Megwatch on Jenna Madzwin. Mie, Kachimarach.
Nali kusuga yunga kanyak siname. Katima yoti lunga kibgaktuig lunga lo Royal Canadian Geographical Society, timio yo Canada mione Canada miglo kauyima yaulikan na kublubo. Kuveru larik punga ilitarayaw na kaktilo no nakakak o kauhe bot pillareo ma inonip titno, peko hip titno, ilako hip titno, Kinau niptitnik nakingang niptitniglo ilitak hijutautman. Kauyaman ito kaitigot Inuit o kauhekput ikayok tugaw kan narealik ilinaktit sinikot o kalimakot takayaw titigot mengoy kerving ni taigo hilarinetigot unikatigot ingmiotikot hananwangnikot merkwangnikot titirawyang nikullo ilitakayaw nakakkan nakublogo magna. I am Nellie Kusua from Rankin Inlet. As a Royal Canadian Geographical Society Governor, I am very happy to support the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Our language for Indigenous peoples is very important to our culture and who we are, as well as the places we live. We can revitalize language through our culture, using our knowledge and expertise in teaching, arts, parks, and literature. Matna, thank you.
Well, just as there's a biological web of life around the planet, so too is there a cultural web of life. And you might think of that as the ethnosphere. And you could define the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, ideas and inspirations, myths and memories brought into being by the human imagination at the dawn of consciousness, since the dawn of consciousness. And the ethnosphere, in some sense, is our collective legacy as a wildly creative and imaginative species. And just as the biosphere is being severely eroded with the loss of habitat, the loss of plant and animal life, so too is the ethnosphere, but if anything at a far greater rate. No biologist, for example, would dare suggest that half of all forms of life are on the brink of extinction, dire as the situation is, and yet that the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And that, of course, the key indicator of that is language loss. When all of us were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken in the world. Now, a language isn't just a body of vocabulary or set of grammatical rules. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of each particular culture comes in the material world. Every language, I once wrote, is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and cultural and spiritual possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages, by complete academic consensus, half aren't being whispered to infants. Well, there are many people who say, well, wouldn't that be a great idea? You know, wouldn't communication be facilitated if we all spoke one language? And I always say, what a great idea, but let's make that universal language Haida. Let's make it a Nuptatuk. You know, let's make it a Bubwa. And you suddenly begin to feel, as a native speaker of English, what would it be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no means or ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. And yet that dreadful plight is the fate of someone somewhere in the world, roughly every fortnight, because on average, every 2 weeks, some elder passes away and carries with them into the ground the last syllables of an ancient tongue. And this does not have to happen. And the power and the meaning and the potency of a language has nothing to do with the number of people who speak it. It's all about the lineage that it represents and the tree of knowledge that is our collective heritage. Language is the poetry of life. And the key aspect of this, of course, is it signals the most important thing of all, that every culture has something to say. Each deserves to be heard, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. The other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being us. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Every single culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 voices of humanity. And that is a sacred repository of knowledge and wisdom upon which all future generations will depend.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada recognized the crucial importance of Indigenous languages. 5 of the 94 calls to action address Indigenous language revitalization. I'm very pleased to introduce my friend, Chief Willie Littlechild. He's one of the commissioners for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Willie has accomplished so much that no introduction can do him justice. Many people know that he played a crucial role in the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He was also one of the leaders who provided unmatched leadership to make the International Decade for Indigenous Languages a reality.
Transcendentic, maikan mohte on sigason maskochi sikoche. Mio sinomota ewi mamskotomak ino ikskon kaki kikpakngosia ngeton ne win. Hello, and thank you very much for this great opportunity to share with you a bit of the history behind the development of the International Decade on Indigenous Languages, which just began in January of this year. It goes back actually to at least 2005 for my participation when I went to the first international conference on Indigenous languages in Japan. I found out in Japan that our languages were endangered in many parts of the world, at least the indigenous regions of the world. For example, the Secretary General of the United Nations stated in a statement that every 2 weeks, at least one indigenous language dies because the last living speaker of that language has gone on to the spirit world. So from 2005, my journey in this interest of keeping our languages alive began. And it jumps quickly to the United Nations, where we organized an Indigenous caucus for Indigenous languages. Very humble beginnings at the outset. 4 and 5 of us would attend the meetings. But a good result happened because we were able to convince the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues to put it in the agenda as an item for discussion. Long story short, the resolution that came out of that was to have a special session on Indigenous languages, which then requested the General Assembly to adopt a resolution to declare an international year for Indigenous languages. And I had the honor and pleasure to be the co-chair of that particular year, where we uplifted our traditional languages globally. The important outcome of that discussion was to declare a theme for the International Year, the theme being Indigenous Languages Matter for Peace, Sustainable Development, and Reconciliation. So that was the focal point of the International Year. And at the closing session, where I had an opportunity to give the closing statement, I called for the consideration of a UN decade for Indigenous languages, because we learned very quickly, and I think it was obvious at the outset, that it was going to take much more than 1 year to focus on sustainability, the development and maintenance and strengthening of our languages, and in some cases, to revitalize our languages. So after the year ended, the UN accepted our recommendation that a decade be established. But in the meantime, a lot of work was done by a key team of individuals. For example, here I would name a councilwoman, Lori Buffalo, a special assistant, Bobby Herrera, the 4 chiefs of the Muscogees Cree Nation, the national chief, Perry Bellegarde, and a very important, very knowledgeable expert in Indigenous languages, Valerie Galley. So as a theme of us, we thought it might be important to continue the starting focus for the first year. It was important to acknowledge, for example, as to why our languages are important, the oral testimony that tells the truth and story and true meaning of our treaty relationship with the Crown is in our language, in Cree. And because of that realization, the leadership declared in our territory here at Musqueam, Cree would be the official language. And as a result of that, in our curriculum development, we made it mandatory that Cree be a part of our 11 schools' curricula. So different events happened with the guidance of the key persons I just mentioned. So recently, on January 6th, we had an intervening 2 years before the decade could begin. And I was personally a little bit upset that the normal process of an international year being immediately followed by a decade didn't happen in this case. However, the upside of it is it gave us an opportunity to work with UNESCO to continue working in the intervening time on a global action plan. So it's with greatest of gratitude that I've had the opportunity to welcome the decade at the United Nations in New York at the headquarters, but also to go back to the local importance of it. It expresses a very fundamental and important inherent right of our peoples to self-determination, an element of which is culture that includes our languages. So from a legal, from a practical and academic or day-to-day life, our language is a sacred. And we wanted to honor that for others as well, who are in very similar circumstances during the decade. We've broken it down into 3-year timelines where we're going to be focusing on certain themes, whether it's education or health, economic development. Each area will be looked at, and cross-cutting through all that will, of course, be our traditional knowledge, our wisdom keepers that will be engaged in guiding the decade. So it's really important when you look at the data. We were at a point here where only 9% of our population was fluent in Cree. But since in the last 2.5 years that we've had it, in spite of COVID, we've had it in our schools, it's now up to 15%. So it shows you that you can actually reinvigorate and revitalize a language in a short time through the schools. But the key thing for success in our official launch that we had to welcome the decade that was hosted by a tribe in Oklahoma, and we concluded that there are a couple of key elements that we need to maintain throughout the decade to, yes, keep our eye on the theme, the thematic approach, what's more important in terms of all the issues that we face. It's two things. One, that not only should it be taught in all the schools, but it has to be spoken at home. And speaking your language at home is a very fundamental key to success of keeping your language alive. And secondly, when we were asked the question, what do you anticipate or what do you hope for at the end of 2032? What do you want to see? And the delegates concluded that what we would like to see at 2032 is a legally binding convention on Indigenous languages. And that's our long-term goal, to keep our languages strong, make them stronger. I'm familiar with some communities, for example, one community where there were only 4 left that spoke their language. So we need to grow new speakers. And one of the best ways is to begin at home or in the school. And then we will see our languages once again thriving, and our people will be once again proud of who they are. They'll know who they are, where they came from, and know how to speak their language, a gift from Creator, so that we can communicate through prayer to Great Spirit. And that's a very important element of why this is such a key focus for us. So with that, kakyo kinanaskom now, ktatamhinao, and hi, which means I thank you very, very much. You make me very happy.
Kunilok Ilven. Adauhek. Ubangali uktolunga. Adauhek. Ubangalo. Talimat. Akvingalik. Adauhek. Bingahut. Hidamat. Anong me? Ikayong lunga. Adauhek. Mahok.
Kitatamis Joan Grey Eyes Nisikason. I'm speaking today from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatchewan. I encourage Indigenous people and allies working in the field of Indigenous language revitalization to share your work and ideas with one another. There are Indigenous language programs and projects being delivered that are working toward the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. Reconciliation is about rights and the right to properly implement the Indigenous Languages Act and to ensure that the right to Indigenous language revitalization is adequately supported. We need Canada and the world to support the reclamation, revitalization, strengthening, and maintenance of our Indigenous languages. The Royal Canadian Geographic Society can promote the revitalization of Indigenous languages by showcasing the many language initiatives that are taking place across Canada. With that, I would like to thank Chief Perry Bellegarde and the Royal Canadian Geographic Society for giving me the opportunity to share this message. Kinanaskom tinawao.
Koda na tiga son kipok te kauchinia neta weekend neskipizem nikatwaso sap egwakia
Tanse Jada netiga son kipok te kauchinia egwakia
Tanse Jada nesiga son wakamni ochinia gaskamtin ni totem owen egwakia
Tanshe Georgina Dishin Nika Shan Winnipeg ni weekend ni michifni nia. There is such a vibrancy to our Indigenous language that speaks to our culture and our connection to the land. Revitalizing Indigenous languages to me means that we have all of our languages spoken in our communities, and and our voices are strong and rich and vibrant. There is an urgent need to reclaim, revitalize, strengthen, and maintain our languages. It is humbling to me to realize how many of our languages are becoming extinct. The Commission is an independent entity that has a very powerful and strong mandate. It is our goal, ultimately, that every Indigenous language in Canada will be spoken strongly and vibrantly.
Tanshe Kiawao, Josh Morn de Shinakashun, Mistai Sagan, Pei Manitou Sagan Dus Chin, In McChiff Nia, and Ni Pikishwan Lilang McChiff. So hello everyone, my name is Joshua Morin. I am Métis McChiff. My family comes from the Stewart communities of St. Albert and Lac St. Anne, and I speak a little bit of the language that some may refer to as McChiff. The McChiff Cultural Connections Company offers beginner McChiff language courses through our partner St. Albert Further Education, and I do believe that we must preserve our languages because language and culture, they are mere reflections of each other. You can't separate the two, and the way I was taught was that we are McChiff and we are our language. Even when we say it, we say Le McChiff Nianan, which means we are McChiff.
The Office of the Commission envisions that all Indigenous languages be safe, vibrant, and thriving, with a mission to promote and champion all Indigenous languages, to facilitate and support Indigenous peoples in reclaiming, revitalizing, strengthening, and maintaining their languages so no language is left behind. It will be essential to get a baseline relating to these precious and unique languages in order for the office to effectively support, facilitate, and report to Canada.
Stephanie Mickey Adams-Yunga. I am the Executive Director for Indocateg Center for Inuit Children, Youth, and Families. Here at our center, we provide a holistic wraparound service and have a significant focus on cultural and language programming.
Ublatsak Heather Ohelski Yunga, Tukimaktit Yunga ino kategikut nutakkarivingani. Bilirevut Torangayut, Nutakavu Adawami Ontario Milu, Biroksayut, Biroksatsiakoblugit, Inu Hiptingniglu, Okau Hiptingniglu, Kauyimatsiakoblugit. Tatkoa ilinaktivut, Bruce Gigutak, Ammalu, Shannon Hamilton, Ikayoktigiklutik, ilinaktitsivaktut. Tautulaklavu.
And Kendra Tajuna, as Director of Programs, ensures that Inuit students are acquiring culture and language while preparing them for success in K-12 and post-secondary education.
Have our answers. So, do you think the Upik has
life?
Yeah. So do you think this is for the Upik?
No.
Nice try, but I'll show you quickly. It is the Tuktu. And that one was for Nano. Good one.
In 2019, the Government of Canada adopted a new law recognizing the right to revitalize and rejuvenate Indigenous languages. The Indigenous Languages Act was a response to decades of advocacy by Indigenous peoples. One of the provisions in this new act was the creation of Canada's first independent commission for Indigenous languages. Today, I am pleased to speak with the first Commissioner of Indigenous Languages, Cookby Ron Ignace. Cookby Ignace is a long-time Secwepemc leader who has done groundbreaking work to research and reclaim the Secwepemc language. Together with his partner in language and partner in life, Marianne Ignace, the award-winning linguist.
White Perry, is Latin alias Wickton at the It's great to see you and to talk with you again. And I would like to congratulate you on your years of as leader of National Chief, as you're fond of saying, as Oskapawus, which you define, I believe, as meaning in Cree helper, especially for your dedicated work on many other things, but particularly on Indigenous languages. You know, the significance of the UN Decade of Indigenous Languages underscores the implementation of the rights of Indigenous languages, but also the urgency for the maintenance and the reclamation of Indigenous languages worldwide. You know, it goes without saying that we must herald the UN Decade as it provides inspiration and hope for us internationally. in the preservation and maintenance and the strengthening of our languages.
Cook's Gem, thank you, Cook B. Ron. Cook's Gem, thank you so much for your kind words. And I know we've talked so many years about the importance to revitalize our Indigenous languages because of the linkage to self-determination and self-government. You know, we've talked about you need the 5 elements: our own languages, our own lands, our own laws, our own peoples, and our own identifiable forms of government. And so our languages are really who we are as Secwepemc peoples, Nehiyawak peoples, Mi'kmaq peoples, Dene peoples. It's so important to bring these things back. And I know your countless years of advocacy are coming to the top now. I just want to lift you up as well. And thank you for acknowledging leadership for Noskapoyos, a helper or servant. We're nothing more than helpers or servant of the people. And, yes. So
that's for sure.
and so now, with this decade, not only for Indigenous peoples in Canada, you know, with the 70 plus Indigenous languages we have to promote and bring back as living languages in Fluency, you know, we can help and support our Indigenous brothers and sisters throughout the world. And that's why this decade is so fundamental and so important for all of us worldwide. So now, in Canada, and Canada as a country is providing some light with the passage of Bill C-91, the Indigenous Languages Act. You know, this is federal legislation, and you're our first Indigenous Language Commissioner. It's brand new ground, no question. But I want to, before getting into the role of the new Language Commissioner, I want to ask you about some of your research and some of your work. Like, even with your partner, Marianne, you know, you both have done so much to bring back the Secwepemc language. Even the culmination of this book is so important. So tell me a little bit about that. Then we'll get into the who, what, where, when, and why about your new role.
Oh, well, you know, language, the way I mean, my great-grandmother, when I was adopted me as a young baby, and she was the one that instilled me with the language and understanding, because they have the right to choose among their grandchildren or great-grandchildren who they could adopt and raise as their own. And I was fortunate that I was chosen by her, because that is how I've been able to have our language, be fluent in our language, and to maintain it against great odds that I've gone to residential school. And she told me that you go out into the world and tell us and study the world, and once you find out all about the white man's world, you come home and help your people. And so I did that in 1982. I came home as chief. My community stood me up, and we began working, organizing to try to bring our nation together through Shuswap cultural gatherings. We established a 20-year languages program in partnership with Simon Fraser in community for adults. We've also realized that it was important that we document our history, because there's so much revisionist history about our nation and our peoples. And so we set out to write a 10,000-year history of the Secwepemc nation, which the book is a culmination of 30 years of work, but 10 years each of us conducting research and interviewing elders across the nation. Through our oral histories, we were able to go back, and we were able to take our oral histories and line them up alongside of archaeology, geology, genealogy, all the what I call the various ologies, and demonstrate that the facts embedded in our oral history about us as a people on this land are all verified and cross-referenced in all those ologies, and demonstrates that our history contains the factual history of who we are as a people. And we took all those and braided them all together and came up with this book. And for me, the book is our three-legged stool. One is to inform non-Native people about our 10,000-year history on the land, revitalize our history amongst our own peoples, as well as the third one, it will provide evidence for our title case whenever we go forward for our title case someday in the future.
No, it's a valuable resource. So thank you so much for sharing that with the Secwepemc Nation and Canada as a whole and the whole world. Now, I want to get into this this Languages Act, you know, and 2019, it was passed and it achieved royal assent. So what does the Indigenous Languages Act mean in terms of change in this country?
Before I say that, I would like to say that my appointment as commissioner, I never thought I would see this day that it would come, see the Indigenous Languages Act, passed. Never dreamt of the day that I would be the commissioner of the Indigenous Languages Act as a result of the Indigenous Languages Act. So I'm deeply honored and humbled by that appointment.
Cookby, can you remember that day in the AFN Chiefs Assembly when we had Prime Minister Trudeau in the assembly in front of the chiefs, and I was national chief, and you were a chief, you were a Cookby in the audience, and when he announced that they would commit to the development and implementation of an Indigenous Language Revitalization Act. I remember that day because you had your papers and you threw them in the air, and there was so much cheering and hand clapping, and in fact, people were crying. You were brought to tears because finally, to hear from the highest office in this land, the elected office of Prime Minister, to say, yes, we will commit to this. And that was a powerful day. And I remember you on the floor of the Chiefs Assembly.
Yes, that was a very deeply moving, especially after all the years of struggling that we engaged in Indigenous language warriors across the country and leaders. And that was a momentous, historic and momentous moment. Very emotional.
Yeah, no question. And just witnessing that. And now it's 2022, and it's been 3 years since the passing. Tell me again, how do you see it? What does this act, mean for Canada?
Well, let me say first, to contextualize it, the Indigenous Languages Act was, and the creation of the Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages was a direct response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, particularly 13, 14, and 15. It's truly a historic change for Canada. It's going to culminate in a truly historic shift in Canada. Unlike the Indigenous rights that are contemplated in Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, with the Indigenous Languages Act, language rights are not only named, but defined and enacted in legislation, ending years of ambiguity and enabling the implementation of Indigenous languages rights, which we've all dreamed of and longed for. And, and I wish those elders in the beginning of our struggle for this were around to witness this day. So I would dedicate this to them, as well as to those residential school survivors and those that didn't make it home. And this is in their memory.
That's such a fitting statement, because a lot of our elders and knowledge keepers, they kept their language alive by speaking it in secret, in the bushes and in the hideouts. Like, they kept it alive by going to ceremonies secretly. And so it's very fitting that you acknowledge them, and lifting them up at this time.
But equally as important, because the Act establishes the Commission as an independent, and it's important to underscore, as an independent and enabling framework to assist Indigenous peoples across the country, as my elders were fond of saying, as buchentem, as umakstem, to breathe life back into our languages and to stand them up in their rightful place in this country.
That's a strong statement. It's like our elders say, our languages are, each and every one of us, they're sleeping. And now it's time to wake them up. And there's different ways to wake them up. And in your role as our very first Indigenous Language Commissioner, you're the Commissioner for Indigenous Language in Canada. What does that role mean to you? How do you see that role unfolding in Canada now?
Well, before I'd like to make one more point about the Indigenous Languages Act, if I don't mind, and I'll. The Indigenous Languages Act is the first legislation that gives definition to the constitutional meaning of Indigenous languages right. And the significance of it is that it's the first in Canadian legislation. And I hope it's not the last.
No, that's key, because before we used to have a language program. Programs, policy, but this is law. This is legislation now, and that's the key difference. So I'm glad you brought that point out. Totally valid.
Yes. For the role of the Office of the Indigenous Languages Commission is to assist Indigenous peoples across the country, the reclamation, revitalization, and the strengthening of our Indigenous languages so that no language is left behind, especially, sleeping and sign languages. All languages, as you said earlier, are fundamental to our identities, to our relationship to our land, to our spirituality, and especially to our right to self-determination.
Now, this is the decade for the United Nations, decade of Indigenous languages worldwide, globally. And now this organization, called the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, is doing something to help elevate that. Now, organizations like the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and others, and even individuals, what can organizations and individuals do to support the revitalization of Indigenous languages?
The Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages is to carry out audits and reports annually on the progress regarding the implementation of the Act, which is important, in relation to the adequacy of funding, as well as to the measures to restore and maintain fluency on the use and vitality of Indigenous languages across the country. And the Commission is to establish, and this is important, culturally appropriate means to facilitate dispute resolutions and review complaints as the Act allows, requires. And finally, in addition, the Commission's role is to promote public awareness and understanding of the impact of colonization and government policies on Indigenous language in the exercise of our rights, of our languages, in the advancement of reconciliation, And I think it's imperative that that we realize the promise of reconciliation, and that, but it will require a whole Canada approach if we're to attain and create a country that's truly great and good, as our chiefs in 1910 were fond of saying.
Yeah, well, that's a valid point. You've got a huge role, huge mandate, huge responsibility, and it really is. And I'm glad you pointed out, this can't be just one department. This should be government-wide, and that's a valid point, no question. So It's a reconciliation, revitalizing, and bringing back and fluency amongst Indigenous languages should be not just one department, but all of the 30-plus departments in government right now. And that's a huge responsibility upon government. But again, back to your role as our first commissioner, and we need assistance. We need to build bridges. We need to build alliances. So as part of that bridge building and alliance building and reaching out to other organizations, individuals, what can other organizations and individuals do to help bring back the focus and on Indigenous languages, revitalization and fluency in Canada?
Well, there's definitely and absolutely a role for them to play, and there are many ways that which they can participate in assisting in the revitalization of languages, and many reliable resources that they can come across and do research on, especially online. Our people have put their curriculums, their history of their languages, the methods of plans and strategies for the revitalization of languages is all online. What they can do is to learn what language is in your region. Research the history of that language and those peoples, and the status of those languages in that area. And if you can, take a course in that language, learn a language, or at least learn phrases or greetings in that language. So there's much that can be said and done in assisting Indigenous peoples in our revitalization, because our languages are fundamental to the country of Canada. It's part of the Canadian legacy, if you will. So it's important that they participate and assist us. And I would like to say, as a survivor and an escapee from the Kamloops Indian Residential School here, Kunankin as Chimstetten as Suschwan, Hochwait the Kalmuchen Elia is Tzlilchs as Chimchitels, the Smammelk, the Daxpulchilchs, the Tzlek and Elias Daxpulchanwatens, the Pulchilchs, the Tmichs. I would like to express the deepest gratitude for the multitudes of people from across Canada and around the world who paid homage to those of our peoples who didn't make it home and prayed for a greater and just society. And thank you for doing that and standing with us. We appreciated that. It helped ease the burden of grief and trauma on us as of our experiences through residentials. In closing, I would like to say the Indigenous Languages Act is a significant and contribution to the decade of Indigenous languages as a beacon of hope for reconciliation and revitalization and to Indigenous languages worldwide.
Cook's Gem, Cook B. Ron Ignace, our first Indigenous Language Commissioner here in Canada. Thank you so much for your work, for your advocacy, and thank you for so much for accepting the challenge to be our first Indigenous Language Commissioner in Canada. And I really appreciated you highlighting the fact that our 70+ Indigenous languages should be viewed as Canada's national treasures. They're not spoken anywhere else in the world. And it's from the impacts of colonization and the residential schools, we will rise above, and you are providing hope through your work and the efforts of the Commission. So again, thank you so much. Cook's Gem, and we'll be talking soon.
En we as Cookstach Kuchen Elia Chochait, das Elks is Knuchen Kuch, as Suchens Kuch, as Lats and Elliot and Mux. And I thank you and hold you up for your great work and continuing on in your work to help us, for attaining our and implementation of our rights across Canada and around the world.
Again, thank you so much, Cook Biran. Take care.
Be safely on your journey in these trying times.
Yeah, Kista. Take care. On behalf of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, thanks to all of the young people, the artists, the leaders, and the language champions who were part of this event. I'm hopeful seeing inspired people doing the hard work. Together, we can make our languages living languages. Today, you've been introduced to leaders who are working hard to revitalize our languages. Now, I want to challenge each of you to make the International Decade of Indigenous Languages matter. We need a concentrated effort to support Indigenous language learners of all generations at all levels of fluency. This requires support for the speakers and learners, champions and Indigenous people who are leading this vital work. If you're in government or industry, if you work for a school or a university, if you volunteer for a community group, really, no matter what you do, look for ways to support Indigenous people of all ages gaining fluency. Help showcase the beauty of the language. And to the members of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and especially all who are writing, publishing, and helping educate others about this beautiful land, I encourage you to look at how you can use Indigenous languages and Indigenous place names in your research, your teaching, and publications. Your efforts can make all of our work that much stronger and more meaningful. During the decade, together, we must make significant gains for our languages. Egoze, Kenaskum Tinawao.